Here we are. Welcome, Cecilie. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for the presentation. In this presentation, as Anne said, I will explore the concept of structural racism as a barrier to social justice in the migration context. And the main questions that I address are: what role do language and language tests play in structural racism? And what can we as a community of professional language testers do in order to confront this kind of language test misuse? My presentation is largely influenced by the work of these great thinkers. Elana Shuhaimi, who highlights that even the most perfect test may have harmful consequences, and stresses the far-reaching ethical responsibility of language testers. Patricia Hill Collins, who emphasizes the importance of academic engagement in achieving social change, and Martha Nussbaum, for underscoring the significance of compassion and empathy in achieving a more social just society. The basic idea of social justice is that all members of society should have equal access to fundamental rights, goods, and opportunities. In practice, this means equal access to schooling and higher education, to jobs, housing, health, safety, and democratic participation. A substantial body of research points to racism as an obstacle to social justice for migrants and their children. But what is racism? Indeed, there is no single agreed upon definition of this term among researchers. So I thought I would approach the concept by sharing 3 examples from my own country. In 2001, 15-year-old Benjamin Hermansen was stabbed to death by neo-Nazis outside his home in Oslo. The only reason he was murdered was the color of his skin. The killing of Benjamin Hermansen was an explicit and unconcealed act of racism, and easily recognized as such. It resulted in huge anti-racist torchlight processions all around the country, with more than 40,000 taking part in Oslo alone. 10 years later, on July 22nd, 2011, Norway witnessed the most severe terror attack since World War II. 77 people were killed by a right-wing extremist, the large majority being teenagers participating in the yearly youth camp of the Socio-Democratic Labour Party at Utøya. Even though the reasons for this attack are more complex, there is little doubt that the motivation was ideological. It was an attack on a political party which strives for social justice, solidarity, and equality. A party which the terrorist held responsible for having turned Norway into what he described as a multi-ethnic and multicultural state. In August 2019, the Al-Noor Islamic Center outside Oslo was attacked, once again by a right-wing extremist, and with the purpose this time of killing as many Muslims as possible, as he himself explained. He was disarmed by 2 elderly members of the Islamic Center, who thereby bravely prevented what could have ended in yet another mass killing. Tragically, after he had been detained, it became clear that only hours before, the terrorist had committed another racially motivated attack, killing his own stepsister Johanne, adopted from China. I have included this example to illustrate 2 points. Firstly, that racism is not something that happens somewhere else or in another time. And secondly, that racism is complex. It takes different forms. The above examples are all extreme acts of violence that not only raise public revulsion, but are also clearly violations of the law. To understand the complex nature of racism, it is important to acknowledge that racism is not limited to discrimination based on so-called biological race, even though this is definitely a central part of it. Racism is also the discrimination of cultural and religious minority, what Balibar refers to as racism without races, sometimes also called neo-racism or cultural racism. Another important insight is that direct, explicit racism is not only legally forbidden, it is also largely socially unacceptable. Only a few extreme groups would openly subscribe to racist ideologies today. This does not mean that racism has ceased to exist. As Bonilla Silva points out in his seminal book, Racism Without Racists, there is a new kind of smiling discrimination, a colorblind racism, and it is this kind of less overt racism that I will focus on in this presentation. When laws, rules, and practices in private or public institutions lead to exclusion and discrimination of individuals due to their ethnic background, we refer to it as structural racism or racialization. The concept of racialization stems from sociological work on racism, and it's based on the idea that the object of study should not be race itself, but rather the process by which race becomes salient as a marker of social difference. An important point in Bonilla Silva's book is that the intentions of individual actors are largely irrelevant to the study of racialization. In other words, structures may have racially unjust consequences even without racist intentions. It may be a result of neglect, of a system being rigged without concern for others than the members of the majority population, hence as a result of a monolingual or monoculture bias. The problem with this kind of racism is that it is often invisible or very hard to spot. Turning now to the first main question of my presentation, what is the role of language in structural racism? And again, I don't have to look far to find examples. For several centuries, Norway practiced a strict and highly efficient linguistic and cultural assimilation policy of the Sami and Kven populations. Both kings and prime ministers have later apologized for this policy, and currently a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is working to further investigate and raise awareness about its consequence. Can we talk about a similar linguistic discrimination of newer groups of migrants today? To explore this question, it is necessary to keep in mind that language has at least two very different roles. The communicative or functional role on the one hand, and the symbolic role linking language to national belonging and identity on the other. These two roles are often confounded in public and political debates about language and linguistic minorities. When a certain level of language proficiency is required for higher education or jobs, it's reasonable to assume that this is because of some very real communicative needs. The language level necessary to function well in academia or in different professions can be investigated empirically through needs analysis. This use of language tests is in principle justifiable. Also, language tests, like all tests, play an important role as the most democratic selection tool in relation to distributive justice, which is core to a socially just society, as we have seen. When, on the other hand, language tests are being used as gatekeepers to human and democratic rights, scholars like McNamara, van Avermaet, and Kahn have argued that it is the symbolic function of language which comes into play. Language is a symbol of national identity, hence learning the language is conceived as a willingness to integrate and to become one of us, ignoring the fact that learning a new language is not equally easy for all. So if language requirements for residency and citizenship are set too high, or when written production is required, the tests serve as an efficient tool for exclusion of the most vulnerable parts, vulnerable test taker groups. A final important point I wish to stress is the following. In modern democracies, where ethnic discrimination is legally forbidden and direct racist rhetoric is socially banned, setting language requirements remains the only form of discrimination which still appears legally and politically acceptable. Language tests can therefore be used as cover-up for underlying racist policies. The infamous Louisiana literacy test and the Australian dictation tests are but two historical examples of language tests used with a deliberate aim to exclude non-whites when political and legal changes had made an explicit discrimination referring to race illegal. So therefore, when language requirements are set, we need to ask ourselves first whether the requirement is justifiable in terms of real communicative needs, or whether the requirement is first and foremost symbolic, serving a purpose of exclusion and control. And second, Even when language requirements are in principle justifiable and there is no reason to assume an underlying racist intention, it is still necessary to ask whether the skills and levels required are indeed appropriate and whether their consequences might still be exclusionary. The use of language tests as gatekeepers has become common policy in Europe over the past decade. In 2007, only a very limited number of European countries had language requirements for citizenship, as you can see from the dark blue countries on this map. In 2018, however, the picture is very different. Now, only 6 out of 41 responding countries did not have language and knowledge of society requirements for citizenship. We still need more research into the complex consequences of this policy for different groups of migrants, but we do know already that the introduction of language requirements for citizenship leads to less migrants gaining citizenship. Studies from different countries show the same. This graph shows how the number of new citizens in Norway dropped to under half of the number of the year before and to the lowest number since 2011. A similar decline in numbers of new citizens was also seen in Denmark, where it dropped from 9,000 to a little more than 2,000, as well as in several other European countries, as documented by the INTEC project and the related studies by Ricky van Oers. With this in mind, and turning to the next main question of the presentation, if language and language tests are being used as elements of structural racism, what can we as professional language testers do about it? And to what extent is it our responsibility to prevent such test misuse? Building on Nussbaum and Hill Collins, I would argue that we as academics, as intellectuals, and as humanists have a great responsibility to strive for a social just society. Indeed, echoing Shohei, our responsibility as language test developers goes even further. Consequences are central to the very definition of validity, dating back at least to Masik's seminal papers from the early 1980s, and almost without exception to all modern approaches to validity in the language testing literature. All language testers striving towards validity have to pay attention to the consequences of their tests. It is quite simply part of our job. And the other reason why we as professionals have an important role to play is that we are the ones who best know what our tests measure and what the results really mean. We have a specialist knowledge into language proficiency and proficiency levels, such as what B1 and B2 means, which in fact both employers and policymakers setting these requirements often lack. Building on the important values of the ILTA Code of Ethics, ILTA recently initiated an advocacy award underscoring the important role of language testers in assuming an active role of public engagement. As underlined by Bonilla Silva, it doesn't necessarily take a racist to uphold a system of structural racism, but it might take an act of deliberate anti-racism to change it. So, in the few minutes left to me, I will present a model of language test activism developed by Lorenzo Rocca and myself, showing how we need to work in different areas and different ways to prevent language test misuse in the immediate term and to ensure a more socially just society in the longer term. If you would like more detail about the model, for instance, why we chose to call it activism and not advocacy, you can read our article, Language Test Activism, which will shortly appear online in a special issue of the journal Language Policy, edited by Piet van Avermaet and Alana Shohei. One obvious way to work for change is to approach policymakers directly. This is what Hill Collins refers to as speaking truth to power. Language testers may influence policy through responses to public hearings, through letters directed to politicians, through meetings with policymakers, or with the opposition or other relevant pressure groups. Since the people choose their politicians, it's equally important to inform the public. This is what Hill Collins refers to as speaking truth to the people. Language test activism at this level means taking an active part in the public debate about language requirements and language tests through writing newspaper chronicles, taking part in radio and TV debates, getting in touch with employers and educational institutions, while also ensuring that the problem of language test misuse features in the public debate. The importance of raising teachers' test literacy is widely recognized. Teachers may play a crucial role as a pressure group for political change. In addition to language test professionals, language teachers are often the one group who actually knows what the language requirements, such as the different CFR levels, really mean, and how difficult it is for certain groups of migrants to meet these requirements. Raising a critical awareness among teachers of potential test misuse is therefore of great importance. We should not forget, however, the importance of working critically and ethically within the area of practical language test development itself. Here, language testers may take action to focus specific attention on marginalized test taker groups, such as refugees, low-literate learners, LGBTQ candidates, or candidates with post-traumatic stress disorder or disabilities. Finally, language test activism in the area of research implies using research as a driver for change. This implies focusing research attention on topics such as the consequences of tests for different groups of test takers, as well as for society, regarding, for example, how tests influence migrants' opportunities in education and labor, democratic participation, and human rights, as well as how language requirements affect democracy, the labor market, and the welfare state in the long run. In short, asking questions about test misuse and consequences, as argued by Shohemi, McNamara, Van Avermaet, and others over the past 20 years. Some will claim that as professionals and as researchers, we should strive towards being value neutral and not take on an active role to work for social change. I disagree with that view. Language testing is a highly value-loaded enterprise. And I think that we, as humanists, as intellectuals, and as language test professionals, have an ethical and professional responsibility to use our knowledge to uncover cases where language tests form part of structural racism, and to use our voices as professionals to speak up against test misuse. At the end of the day, that is what ethically responsible language testing is all about. I will give the last word to Glenn Fulcher and Fred Davison, who state that the value of our activity as professionals can be judged by the extent to which our work contributes to the opportunities which our tests open up to all the citizens of our society. Thank you.
Very much indeed for that very thought-provoking presentation. Cecilie, it was absolutely wonderful. And thank you also for finishing bang on time with, I think, a second to go. I'm sure we've all kinds of questions, and we look forward to putting them to you, perhaps in a social context throughout the conference. But thank you again for a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.